Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Suann Bell. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Nursing. I'm a nurse scientist and family nurse practitioner, and my work focuses on disaster response. Dr. Paige Fischer is our main speaker today for our Center for Global Health Equity seminar series, which is focused on climate change and health. Dr. Fischer is an associate professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on human adaptation to climate and natural hazards, such as wildfire and forested areas, and her work has focused on the American West, but has recently expanded to South Central Chile, where wildfires are becoming more frequent and severe. I want to thank the people that are in the audience. That is faculty, staff, students, and alumni. We have faculty and students from other universities, global collaborators, and collaborators from Chile. I wanted to thank our co-sponsors from the Office of Global Public Health, the International Institute, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the School for Environment and Sustainability. So I'm thrilled to have Dr. Fischer with us today, and I'd like to invite her to begin her presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to speak as part of this series and to share about my experience in Chile. And I'm also excited to know that a few of my Chilean colleagues and people who I work with in communities have joined the meeting today. So today I'm going to share some reflections on what I learned during the 3 months I spent in Chile during my sabbatical earlier this year, doing exploratory research on the topic of wildfire. I'm going to talk about wildfires and community well-being in Chile. I was hosted by the University of Southern Chile, Universidad Austral de Chile, and the Center for Fire and Resilience of Social Ecological Systems, and I was supported by a Fulbright Award. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about my background and my research interests. Then I'm going to go over a couple of key concepts, and then I'm going to explain why I chose Chile and what I was investigating, and then I'm going to share what I saw and what I learned. The upshot is that my research is motivated by recognition of the need to understand and foster adaptation to climate change in human communities and ecological communities. As a social scientist, I focus on people, and I focus mainly at the local level, at individuals and households and community levels about how they adapt to climate change. However, I recognize that broader social and environmental conditions can constrain adaptation at these local levels, such that in some cases, large-scale, more fundamental change is really what's needed. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, about how in South Central Chile, local community level wildfire risk and adaptation to wildfire risk is embedded within larger social ecological systems that exacerbate wildfire risk and constrain what local communities can do about it. So despite my research focus on the local level, what I realized in Chile is that, and what really needs to be considered is transformational adaptation. So large scale adaptation at higher levels. Okay, so first, a little bit about me and how I came to have this opportunity to investigate wildfire and community well-being in Chile. So in terms of my background, my formal trainings in anthropology and forestry. I have a BA in cultural anthropology. I did a PhD with an anthropologist who was also a forester. Then I did a postdoc with an anthropologist in the research arm of the Forest Service. Although I really identify more with human environment geography, that's where I publish. But interestingly, my first kind of research experiences were really international. I had a Fulbright right out of college to study forest gardens or forests and culture in Sri Lanka. Then I work for a nonprofit organization on forest conservation in the Pacific Rim. But my academic career has really focused on human adaptation to environmental change domestically in the United States, all in the context of forests and mostly relating to wildfire. So the sabbatical offered an opportunity for me to reconsider incorporating international work into my research program and to consider my own research questions in a more global context. So my research and interests are broadly about behavioral adaptation to climate change. So that means, how do people, really individuals, households, and communities, kind of at the local level, how do they experience and perceive and act to reduce risk? And how do people's responses feed back to shape risk within the larger social ecological systems in which they are embedded? for example, through land management practices or land use practices. I'm really interested in wildfire adaptation in particular. So how do people perceive wildfire risk and their own capacity to reduce it? And what psychosocial factors influence whether and how they act. So my current focus, just really briefly, is that I'm leading the Western Forest and Fire Initiative, which is based out of University of Michigan. It's an interdisciplinary team. And our driving question is, how can human and ecological communities adapt to more flammable, smokier, and power-disrupted conditions in the US West? And we do this with a goal of improving scientific understanding of adaptation to wildfire risk as a complex social ecological system. We do this to build the capacity of wildfire scholars, and we do this to support practitioners who are working on the problem. So a little bit about the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today: adaptation and well-being. So adaptation is generally defined when we're talking about the community level as the process of behavioral adjustment in response to or anticipation of climate change to reduce the risk of adverse impacts and or increase well-being. So the audience here that I'm speaking to, I think, has a pretty good idea that well-being is a complex construct and one that's really hard to operationalize. But in general, we're talking about the social and economic and environmental and political and cultural conditions that are essential for groups of people to flourish and fulfill their potential. So that's what I'm referring to when I use the term well-being. In terms of adaptation with the goal of increasing well-being or reducing risk to well-being really can or should be looked at as a spectrum. It's not just whether you're adapting or not. Really, it's kind of a spectrum where at one end, you're coping with environmental change. And then at the other end, if you're successfully changing your behavior to reduce risk and increase well-being, you're adapting. And we can look at this in terms of how purposeful your actions are, whether they're kind of autonomous, so drawing on existing knowledge and techniques, or whether it's really planned, so you're leveraging institutions and policies. We can look at this in terms of the timing, whether it's reactive or proactive. And we can also look at it in terms of the scale or the scope, whether it's incremental, so making small changes to kind of maintain stability, or whether it's transformational, so really making large fundamental changes that are really new to a system. So that's how I look at adaptation, is really kind of on a spectrum. So one of the topics that I said I would talk about today is resilience. So where does resilience fit into this? Resilience is defined as the capacity to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain essential function, identity, or structure. And it's generally considered in the kind of field of adaptation as a positive attribute when it maintains our capacity for adaptation. So like this figure depicts, there's disruption. We lose capacity in terms of our function as a community, and we rebuild that back up by bouncing back. And that sets us up to continue adapting. But resilience is not synonymous with adaptation. It's a little bit, if we look back at this table and the spectrum, it's kind of a little bit more towards coping, regaining stability, recovering, reacting, not really proacting or engaging in transformational change. So those are the concepts I'm going to be talking about throughout the presentation. So now on to Chile. Why Chile? What was the draw for me to extend my research to Chile during my sabbatical? Well, South Central Chile has a very similar wildfire problem as compared to the Western US, which has been the geographic focus of my research. And the shared challenges between the US West and South Central Chile are really different from other regions with seasonally dry ecosystems like Southern Europe and Australia, where we hear a lot about wildfires. In that, in the US West and South Central Chile, climate change is driving wildfire from fuel-limited areas where you find kind of Mediterranean-type species, like the areas here in this map that are in kind of the northern part, that are in light green. So climate change is driving wildfire from those fuel-limited areas into drought-limited areas, areas where you find wetter, deciduous, and coniferous forests, which are in the darker green and kind of the bright green, the two other green colors. So just as in the US West, where the news coverage used to focus on large wildfires in Southern California, and now you're hearing about fires in Northern California and Western Oregon, which are kind of wetter, moister areas. In Chile, damaging fires that used to break out up near Santiago, in the northern part of South Central Chile, are now moving or occurring further south. So that is a really interesting phenomenon that makes Chile really similar to the US West. Why is this happening in Chile? Well, the drivers are actually quite similar as the US West. We have increasing ignitions. Population growth has led to land use change, which means that there are more people living intermixed in forested areas, and that leads to more ignitions. There's also some evidence that there's more lightning because of climate change, but I'm not going to go into this. I'm just providing a citation. Also, flammable forest conditions are a really big driver. So in Chile, there's been a large expansion of plantations from the northern part of the country into the southern part of the country that have created dense, homogeneous conditions where flames can easily reach up into the canopy and spread across forests. And in addition, drought stress and hotter, drier conditions caused by climate change have led to more dead and dry vegetation that catches fire easily. So I want to talk a little bit more about plantations as a driver of wildfire risk, because this is something that is different than the US West. Chile has a long history of production-oriented forestry dating back to early colonial periods. However, most notably after the 1973 coup backed by the United States that put Pinochet in power, there was major restructuring around neoliberal economic model, and the country rapidly expanded its export-oriented plantation sector. So this map just kind of shows that expansion of the red area, which is plantations, from 1986 to 2001 to 2011. So there's been an expansion of plantations. According to the FAO, 22% of Chile is forested, and 15% of this forest land is in plantations, mostly owned by a few companies, and mostly in two highly flammable species, eucalyptus and radiata pine or Monterey pine. It's also documented that wildfires are igniting and burning primarily in plantations rather than native forests. So you can see the relationship by comparing these maps and looking at comparing the distribution of plantations with in red in the left panel, and then with the distribution of high wildfire counts, which is in red in the right-hand panel. So, and I've also kind of identified the names of the regions there where this is a most relevant problem. So these plantations and these wildfires are not just distributed across a homogeneous social landscape, they're also distributed across a social landscape, and that social landscape is not homogeneous. Incomes are much higher in the northern part of South Central Chile, whereas proportions of original peoples and rural populations are much higher in the southern part of this region, of South Central region. As you can see from these three maps, that the darker is more concentration or higher proportion. Notably, during the Pinochet administration, significant amounts of forest land were privatized, especially and most controversially in the southern part of the South Central region of Chile, in the Biobío and La Araucanía regions, historically dominated by original peoples with contested land rights. So what's happening right now is that the country is experiencing large fires more frequently, and these fires are occurring more frequently in the historical lands of the Mapuche Indians, also known as the regions also known as Wallmapu. So as you can imagine, the wildfires are having adverse effects on the well-being of local communities. They're causing injury and loss of life and property, releasing a lot of harmful smoke, which leads to double exposure, since most populations in Chile, even urban populations, rely on wood fuel for heating. And so there's a lot of smoke in the wintertime and a lot of smoke in the summertime now. There's a lot of impacts in terms of income earning potential, and there's a lot of stress, physical, mental health, and psychological stress, largely on rural and urban poor communities. As you can see from the table, the effects have been worse for the more southerly communities in the Biobío and La Araucanía regions. In the last fire season alone, these regions experienced more fires, so like looking at the first couple rows here, more fires, greater area burned, more homes destroyed, more people affected, as compared to the northern region of Valparaiso. A large number of agriculture and forest producers have been affected, and the southern regions also experienced more injuries, more fatalities, and then the northern region, and they experienced many agricultural and forest producers were affected, and they also experienced more injuries, more fatalities, and many loss of livestock, and crops were lost. They don't distinguish. I can't distinguish those between the Biobío and the Araucanía region, but just more impacts in the southern region. That's the takeaway there. The government is addressing the wildfire problem. The National Forest Corporation, or CONAF, which is the agency that manages public forest lands and fights fires on those lands, that agency is administering a suite of programs to combat fires, reforest after fires, educate the public about the need to prevent fires, and provide short-term assistance to communities to create defensible space. That means clearing areas around their houses, their structures, their communities to prevent fires from moving in. Their main program is the Community Prepared Against Forest Fires program, which supports the creation of committees within communities to organize these defensible space and other kinds of fire risk reduction efforts into the future. The private sector has also tried to address the problem. Individual plantation companies have developed extensive wildfire firefighting operations and are exploring preventative forestry techniques such as thinning and fuel breaks and pruning and spacing of trees. CORMA, the Association of Forest Industries, has funded a program called the Community Fire Prevention Network, which helps communities educate themselves about defensible space practices, and it helps them build local institutions for planning wildfire risk reduction and response activities. These programs are in many ways adaptation efforts at the national level and at kind of higher institutional levels, in that they aim to reduce wildfire risk for the country, and they try to help communities reduce their own risk. Yet the problem is the communities continue to experience declines in well-being due to wildfires despite these programs. So during my time in Chile, I spent 3 weeks traveling through 3 regions: Valparaiso, Biobío, and Araucanía. And I visited a number of different communities that were affected by the 2022-23 wildfires. So I want to share what I learned about a few of those communities and my views about how their responses to wildfire risk relate to these concepts of adaptation, resilience, and well-being. I do want to mention the 2022 to 2023 fire season, which ran from December to February, right before I arrived on March 1st, was devastating, especially in the Biobío and the La Araucanía regions. I drove through many areas of total destruction as far as the eye could see, with forests and communities razed to the ground. The words that came to my mind were environmental disaster. I chose to visit communities where I felt I would not be further traumatizing people. So the communities I'm going to discuss are those that were affected by the fires to varying extents, but not totally devastated by them. So starting in the north was Oasis La Campana, just outside La Campana National Park, home to the southernmost palm tree species. In addition to high natural amenities, the community has a lot of economic and political capital. Many of the residents had moved there from urban areas and were former professionals, so they had access to substantial information and resources. They had experienced few fires and not the devastating large-scale wildfires that other areas had experienced, but they were concerned, and so they were participating in the CONAF Community Prepared Against Forest Fires program. They formed their own brigade, equipped with sophisticated firefighting gear and equipment, funded by the residents. They were doing a lot of evacuation planning and communicating with other neighboring communities. In many ways, they were engaging in behavior that was consistent with adaptation. So planning ahead, drawing on resources from CONAF and other experts, proactively building their capacity to reduce risk within their community and on the larger landscape. A different community also in Valparaiso is Villa Cumbres in Alto Viña del Mar. So this community is located above the coastal tourist town of Viña del Mar, which is a coastal town surrounded by steep bluffs on which landless working class people have formed unplanned settlements of self-built homes, or acampamientos. In this area, fires burn through vegetated ravines from the lowlands to the ridges, and the communities at the top, these acampamientos, are surrounded by lands owned by the Navy. that at one point were planted with eucalyptus pine, but are and pine, but are now abandoned. So in Villa Cumbres, interestingly, women were at home in the community when the 2020 fire started, and many men were not. And so the women of the community had to fight the fire on their own, often with their young children nearby. And now these women's groups have taken on the challenge of leading fuel reduction efforts and preparedness efforts in their community. And they've been participating in the CONAF community preparedness against forest fires. However, they have fewer resources than other communities. And so they haven't been able to build their own firefighting capacity. They also don't have control over the surrounding Navy-owned lands. So in other words, this community is, I would say, more reactively coping through autonomous efforts to prevent wildfires. They have limited capacity to adapt through planned productive efforts. And they have limited capacity to transform the wildfire risk conditions in and around their community.Moving south into Biobío, I visited the sites of the devastating February 2023 Santa Ana fires. These fires appear to have started kind of accidentally as part of a brick operation. Just happened to be on an extremely hot, windy day, ignited a fire that spread into the plantations and across a large part of the regions, burning thousands and thousands of hectares and many, many rural small farms and woodlots. The community of Nacimiento had already formed a committee through the Corma Community Fire Protection Network. They had done a lot of education and defensible space work before the fire, but many of the areas were devastated anyway. I interviewed a woman whose multi-household extended family had lost all of their homes, their farm animals, their woodlots. And when I was talking to her, she pointed to the burnt plantations that kind of extended as far as the eye could see along the ridge behind her land and said, really, there's not much that can be done to mitigate a large fire like this when it's burning through thousands of acres of pine and eucalyptus surrounding you. I mean, what can you do? At the same time, when I talked to her about what she was going to do next, what were the next steps after rebuilding her house and her outbuildings, and she said, her family's economic situation was such that they planned to replant their own woodlots with eucalyptus and pine because it grew quickly and they would be able to regenerate the woodlots that they derive much of their income from through the sale of firewood. So this is an example of a community that had taken some planned actions to address wildfire risk, but in the end, really their real option was being resilient, coping with wildfire risk, and they really had limited ability to transform wildfire risk and ensure their well-being going into the future by shaping hazardous forest conditions around them. So finally, in the southernmost region where I visited communities, Canilla, I visited several native Mapuche communities surrounded by burned pine and eucalyptus plantations. And residents of these communities were understandably furious with the situation. They believed that the forest lands surrounding them that had been burned were their historical homelands that had been stolen from them by the Pinochet administration and handed over to industrial timber plantation companies who had mismanaged the land and turned it into a tinderbox, which then burned and spread onto their own lands, damaging their crops, killing their farm animals, etc. They believed at the same time there's really little they could do to reduce the risk of wildfire because of this surrounding landscape situation. And I should note there's some evidence that some Mapuche people are intentionally igniting fires, or at least talking about that as an act of sabotage to protest the plantation companies' practices and the historic theft of their land. And in some ways, just get rid of the fire hazard. So Juan and Tipi was one of the communities I visited, totally surrounded by plantations. They had formed a committee and had been working with CONA on defensible space creation. And through this program, they were able to access a wood chipper that they used to clear out brush around their homes and outbuildings. Nevertheless, they were affected by the wildfires anyway. And again, another example of a community whose only option is to cope with environmental change, to be resilient in the aftermath of wildfires, because and they have really limited ability to really make dramatic change because they have few economic resources to draw on to reduce wildfire risk on their own lands, and they have zero control over the hazardous conditions on the plantation lands that surround them. So I'm going to just briefly mention the final community. I know we got started late, and so we're low on time, but Villa Coihueco is really similar to one in Tipi in that it's a Mapuche community surrounded by foreign-owned pine plantations that burned completely around the community. One thing that was interesting about this community is they were really frustrated by the fact that they had so little influence or no influence on the plantations that surrounded them, because they felt like they had really strong norms of cooperation within their culture, within their community, that could be leveraged for forest thinning beyond their community borders. I think that they said they had tried to reach out to the plantation owners to see if maybe they could do some things on that land that could help prevent fire from spreading off those plantations into their own community. But they weren't able to communicate with anybody because it was owned by a foreign corporation. So they have no access to the plantations. So yet another example of a community that has, social capital, not very many access, not substantial access to resources, but they had community behaviors they could leverage if only they could have some more control over the surrounding landscape, but they didn't. So those were the communities that I visited while I was in Chile, and some of what I saw in terms of their efforts to reduce wildfire risk, and how some of their efforts could be kind of viewed through the lens of adaptation and resilience and well-being. And so what does this mean? What are the implications for community well-being? Well, the overwhelming theme was that communities were organizing themselves both autonomously and in a planned manner with support of public programs to reduce wildfire risk and improve their preparedness for wildfire events. However, they were skeptical about their ability to reduce wildfire risk to their communities because of the surrounding landscape and fire conditions. Their options really seemed to be more limited to coping with wildfire risk and being resilient after wildfire events, but not really adapting. Moreover, there's clearly an uneven distribution of wildfire risk and capacity for adaptation across South Central Chile from the north to the south. This is what else I became aware of. This is partly due to biophysical conditions where the northern areas have less productive forests and therefore less fuel to burn than the southern areas. But it's a lot also on account of the political history, which has led to slower economic development in the southerly rural regions and has resulted in the expansion of flammable plantations into those southerly regions with little accountability. And so the result has been poor people living in areas with greater risk. And so, in the north, I saw rural residential urbanites with high adaptive capacity forming brigades, also peri-urban informal settlements with some ability to cope, but surrounded by lands they couldn't control. And then moving further south, more rural, agricultural, more impoverished communities, also able to cope, but again, surrounded by lands they can't control. And even further south, native communities who are suffering so many stressors beyond just wildfire risk, having the capacity to cope, but still surrounded by plantations they can't control. So in the last couple minutes, I just want to kind of bring this back up to some of the concepts of coping and adaptation. And one concept that clearly emerged as a relevant lens to look at the situation is this idea of interplay between coping and adaptation, and between institutions that are really trying to foster adaptation. So when I'm talking about institutions, I'm not talking about organizations. I'm talking about sets of kind of decision or formalized decision-making processes and the actors involved in those decision-making processes. And interplay is the idea of when you have one or more institutions at different levels engaging in adaptation efforts, but their efforts are kind of interacting either positively or negatively. In some cases, their efforts can run counter to each other. They could also be mutually beneficial, or they could simply coexist. Or in other situations, those efforts can interact with each other and exacerbate problems. And so in Chile, my take is that national level wildfire adaptation efforts at best are kind of coexisting with local efforts that are really more coping efforts. And at worst, they're really running counter to local efforts. And moreover, those effects are really socially differentiating in that they're not uniformly distributed across the country. So to further explain that what I mean by this, it's that there are these planned efforts going on through these agencies, but these planned efforts can undermine more local autonomous efforts. So preventative forestry and fire protection on plantations can really prevent, putting all that resources into that level can prevent communities from really reducing long-term risk because it's not giving agency to communities to influence the lands around them. Also, the preventative forestry and fire protection efforts that are occurring kind of on the lands around the communities really supports coping, but really not long-term adaptation in terms of improving in the face of wildfire risk. Also, the efforts by these programs to build adaptive capacity without the opportunity for really shaping adaptation, really isn't helping in the long run. It's just perpetuating coping and asking communities to be resilient. Now, the local efforts can help the national efforts. So local adaptation efforts can help accomplish national goals. So communities' efforts to reduce wildfire risk does contribute to wildfire risk reduction nationally. But in terms of really, if national goals are really to improve and protect the well-being of people, of society into the future as climate change drives more wildfire events, really, it's not really helping that if communities are really limited in their ability to protect themselves. And especially those communities want to see plantations eliminated. And that's one of the options that they're going to use for trying to protect themselves. That undermines national level adaptation. So if the final thing I want to say is just that the takeaway here is that there's a conflict between the national level adaptation and community well-being efforts. National level policy is really perpetuating plantation forestry while targeting communities with these protection programs that really aim to help, but really are asking communities to be resilient and to cope with increasing wildfire risk. Whereas community well-being, communities just really are really challenged in their ability to reduce risk. And communities, because of the situation with plantations and their inability to shape that kind of national level policy, they're really being prevented from taking the most effective measures to reduce risk, which would be to shape the landscape around them. So I know we're running out of time. I think I've made most of my points. I think the big thing is we really need to think about national level policy in Chile, that Chileans need to think about national level policy and how it may be resulting in running counter to local interests. We really need to, or Chileans need to rethink the role of plantations and the role of communities in managing them, especially in areas where Mapuche communities are surrounded by fire hazard on their historic homelands. And then finally, really transformational adaptation, at that far right of that table that I talked about, really maybe one of the real only effective options given the situation in Chile. So with that, I want to share some pictures of my Chilean colleagues and the community members who showed me around and helped me understand the situation in Chile. And I want to thank the Fulbright program and the Universidad Austral de Chile and Fiereses, and my many colleagues and community members, the community members who helped me have an amazingly enlightening experience in Chile. Thank you very much. With that, I will, stop sharing my screen.
Right. Thank you so much for that talk. That was truly amazing. And I'm fascinated and looking forward learning more from you about some of the work you've done and seeing some of the work you've done, reading manuscripts from your work. I have a couple of questions to ask, and then I hope we have time. We have about 10 minutes, so hopefully we have time for some questions that I've already seen are in the chat. So I'm going to start with one first question, which is thinking about, kind of the key point you made about planned efforts that undermine local or autonomous efforts. So when we're, thinking about what steps can be taken to ensure equitable outcomes for affected populations, how can we think about these steps in terms of addressing the concept of climate justice?
Well, that is a really, really good question. I think that wildfires in Chile are a really good example of a climate justice challenge. The regions where the wildfire crisis are really escalating in Biobío and La Araucanía really are places where, there's lower household levels of household income, higher proportions of original peoples and rural populations. And it's where plantation forestry has been expanding. And so if we think about climate justice, so providing equitable opportunities for people to adapt, we really need to be focusing in the areas where people are the most vulnerable and where people face the greatest challenges. And so thinking about where to prioritize public or planned adaptation efforts in line with the concept of climate justice, that would mean we would focus in places like Biobío and Araucanía, and the acampamiento communities in Valparaiso. So I think that it really helps us think about where to put efforts and also how transformative our efforts need to be. I don't know if it's consistent with the idea of climate justice to expect communities to be resilient to wildfires, to bounce back after being affected by wildfires, or to cope with wildfire risk if we're not also trying to create opportunities to really transform wildfire risk conditions so that they can maintain their well-being or improve their well-being despite environmental change, because that's really what adaptation, that's really how adaptation should be evaluated.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to some of the audience questions, and I might come back to some of the questions I prepared. So one of the first questions I see from the Q&A is, Chile is a country of multiple natural disasters. The country's gone through important earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. Do you think these experiences in the past have shaped community capacities to react to wildfires?
I think so. I think there are different kinds of natural hazards. Chile is well recognized for their ability to learn to live with earthquakes through technical improvements and habitation patterns. Volcanic eruptions are kind of similar. I guess they happen less frequently, but they are short, like sudden onset kinds of disasters where people need to recover from them. You can't really prevent earthquakes, and you can't really prevent tsunamis that follow. You can't really prevent volcanic eruptions, at least not directly. But also, I was jumping to thinking about like flooding, because there's been a lot of flooding natural disasters. You can't really prevent extreme precipitation events directly, although there's a lot of evidence that those are the result of anthropogenic climate change. Wildfire is really different in that we create the hazard in the way that we manage our lands, what we plant, how we manage vegetation, how we build houses and structures in that vegetation. It's not something that just happens exogenously. We create that hazard, and we do that through policy and behavior. And so I think Chile is a good example, like the United States, very much, where we've created in different ways through different mechanisms, we've created natural disasters that we now have to contend with.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I am going to go with another question. In Chile, are state or local health departments involved in assisting or supporting communities on climate action, especially around preventing, mitigating, and adapting to climate impacts of wildfire smoke?
My understanding, yeah. So in today's talk, I spoke mainly about the two institutions or entities that are helping communities with, I would say, more of the adaptation side, so reducing risk of wildfire events. But there are many, many local and national level agencies and organizations that are helping communities recover and be resilient to natural disasters, including wildfire events. The two that I talked about were really focusing more on I would say, adaptation-oriented efforts in terms of managing land and habitation patterns to reduce risk.
Thanks, Paige. I'm getting so many good questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure we're not going to get to all of them. So I'm going to go with one more. Do the contradictions between state, national, and local adaptation also apply in areas of the U.S. West that you've studied? Are communities in the U.S. West similarly disempowered for land management? Great question.
It's a really good question. And this is why going abroad and doing international work really helps you understand more about the situation in where you're from or where you normally work. So I don't think I would have originally thought that, but now I realize, there are some similarities, especially in the US West, where 60% of the land is in federal ownership. And so in many ways, it's similar in that communities are surrounded by lands that they don't directly control. And the risk of wildfire to communities primarily comes, wildfires start in communities for sure, in vegetation and through lightning and different kinds of things that people do, burning garbage or whatever. But wildfires also come off of those federal lands. So the conditions on federal or public lands surrounding communities cause risk to those communities and threaten community well-being. The difference is that in the United States, we have a very long history of public participation in federal land management. We also have several mechanisms through which communities can influence federal land management. We have programs like the Community Forest Landscape Restoration Program, where communities can influence how federal land is managed and priorities. We have programs such as the Joint Chiefs Initiative between the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which actually funds private landowners in doing wildfire risk reduction work on their lands adjacent to or near federal lands, and also helps coordinate wildfire risk reduction activities on public lands and in communities. We have, through our National Fire Plan and other federal legislation, we have a lot of resources that support communities in becoming fire adapted. So there are more opportunities, I think, in the United States for communities to influence the conditions that surround them, that pose risk to them. And that is because of 20 years of policy efforts to create those opportunities for communities.
All right, thank you for those answers. And also thank you to the people in the audience who put such great questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry that we don't have time to get through all of them. I think I'm going to turn the conversation over to Dr. Kollars, and just wanted to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed that talk. I'm sure those in the audience did as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. Joe Kollars here. I'm the center director, and I so wanted to introduce Dr. Fischer and Dr. Bell, and my apologies for a technical snafu. But I came on just as Dr. Bell took over. I so enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Fischer. Two things that I took home in particular was one comment about maybe the value proposition of taking our domestic work and going outside of the United States to explore and then see how those reflections might inform one's work domestically. And I thought this was an excellent example of it. Another thing, I couldn't help but think about analogies to our healthcare system. It seems like we put so much work into taking care of people once they've gotten ill, once the fires are underway, but we put so little attention to trying to keep illness or fires from happening. So I really liked how you laid this out for us, and you made me jealous of the kind of work you do and the kind of interest that you have. So a profound thanks to Dr. Fischer and to Dr. Bell for a really enlightening conversation with clearly more work to do on this topic.